Good morning. It is really great to be here and to feel really at home, and I recognise a few faces and to really feel like we're amongst friends. So thanks so much for welcoming us so warmly today. And I'm going to dive straight in. My session today is called Limited God, Limitless Leader. It's not called that. It is called Limited Leader, Limitless God. And I'm just really aware that as I share some of our experiences and hopefully some helpful questions just to prompt thought in you as well, that you're all facing completely different circumstances and different situations to me. But I really feel like God wants to minister in a really contextual way. He calls us all to be sanctified. He calls us all to be made holy. But the way in which he does that and the challenges he allows into our lives are really distinct and individual. But he's able to minister to us. His grace is sufficient in our weakness, but his grace is also wholly contextual to your situation and able to meet you in your deepest needs. So just to give a bit of context, to start really by way of a disclaimer, I'm going to talk a lot today using words like limitations, maybe even Paul's thorn in the flesh, or suffering. And I'm trusting that we can all understand that many of you here as well, many of your limitations come because of having your hands full of good things. God has given you many good things to steward, and that's definitely our situation. I thought I'd just introduce our family, so I'm just going to stick up a quick slide just to introduce them. This is a more recent picture. So we've got three incredible kids. Zeke is 14, Anna is 12, and Sam is 6. And our kids came with some unanticipated challenges. So when Zeke was about 2.5, he went into a developmental regression. He started to lose the ability to do basic play skills, to point, to climb ladders, to speak. And he actually went into reverse, really, for about 9 months, losing those skills, and has been left with moderate learning disabilities. And actually has come on hugely in the last few years and has really surpassed many of our expectations. When we wrote a book called The Life You Never Expected, it feels like that title has been switched on its head many times. And he's really he's come on a lot in the last few years. But after that initial regression, within a year, our daughter started to have seizures. She was 1 at the time and was diagnosed with epilepsy. Her name's Anna. Only for Anna to hit 2.5 and for Anna to go into reverse, but for 17 months lose speech skills, the ability to sing, and just, a whole range of developmental skills, really. And she's been left with very complex learning disabilities and a high level of need. She's a complete delight. She's a handful. All of our kids are a massive blessing from God. We've just got to work out how to wield that blessing. And many of you might have the same. And for you, it might not be family life. It might be a volunteer team or a leadership team where you feel like, God, you've given me these cats to herd. How do I do it? You have given me this snooker table to rugby tackle. How do I do it? This is beyond my limited ability. And just a brief disclaimer before I kick off, really. I'm using the word leader today, and by the word leader, I don't mean any letters on any office door. I mean a gift that God has given you to steward. So if there's any people in the room vulnerable to imposter syndrome, just put that down at the door. Otherwise, I would be completely unqualified as well to deliver this seminar. God gives leadership gift. He gives a sphere of influence, and he gives it to you to steward. And that looks very different in different seasons of life, as we're going to go through. So today, I want to talk to you about where we find ourselves as leaders historically, where we find ourselves theologically, where we find ourselves practically, and where we find ourselves supernaturally. And I've got some questions to lay out as well for you to apply to yourself as you go along. Now, why do I want to start with historically, where we find ourselves as leaders historically, even using words like the title of this talk, Understanding Limitations? We use words like capacity, and we often use them in hushed tones as well. We might say, he's a very high capacity leader. by which we mean he's highly productive. He's able to operate in multiple spheres of leadership with the same consistent high-quality results produced at a steady pace over time, input and output predictably strong. The only other thing that's a problem with that is that when we say that, we might say, she's a very high-capacity leader. We inevitably mean somewhere here are some low-capacity leaders as well. And this language and these metaphors that we use aren't incidental. In fact, you see, we think of the invention of the iPhone as being really culturally momentous, but the way in which the factory floor has given us terms like capacity and terms like limitations really sets the groundwork for the iPhone, because it sets the groundwork for us to become hyper-individualized agents of production. We think in these industrial terms, and we often fail to think in the agricultural terms that Jesus speaks to in the parables as well. So these metaphors aren't incidental. If we can have the first slide, perhaps this will illustrate what I mean. So in the factory, on the factory floor, if you can visualize that, we prize predictable input variables, raw materials. And we prize consistent productivity over long periods of time. Productivity that will look like the same on a Monday as it does on a Tuesday, that will look the same in one season of life as to another season of life, because you are just taking up your place on the factory floor. We prize reliable, high-performance outcomes and stable production lines. So you play your part, the person on the next station plays their part. And all of this is not contingent on the weather that day. It carries on, regardless. And similarly, in the lab, we prize that controlled environment, that highly controlled environment. The lab technician is not vulnerable to extraneous conditions. They prize methodological process and control variables, things that do not change based on season of life, based on the other conditions of life that are around us. And this emphasis that creeps into the way in which we judge our own leadership as well, and perhaps no greater way than in the Excel spreadsheet. So if we've gone through the factory, we've gone through the lab, the Excel spreadsheet is a disaster for us in judging our own leadership. You see, we're constantly measuring how we're doing. We are constantly looking at what's gone in, what's come out, how well have I performed in this quarter. And I remember actually creeping into this, even in terms of family life. I didn't realize how much this mode of thinking, the mode of thinking really that comes from the industrial factory floor to the lab to the spreadsheet, had crept into the way I assessed my worth or my value as a parent, and certainly as a leader. I remember looking at our children and once trying to do the maths. So Zeke was 3, Anna was 2, and we had MRIs, EEGs, ECGs, specialist footwear, speech therapy, OT, physiotherapy. And I was thinking, I was adding it up. I had friends in America who literally had to do this. So I was adding up how much input had been put into them. And then I was thinking, but the trouble is with this spreadsheet is that we've been told that they might never do paid employment. Now, actually, we think God's going to probably, in Zeke's life, confound that expectation. But I had fallen into a capitalist mindset by which I assessed their worth effectively. And we are so vulnerable to doing that. And it's what Jesus came to flip. So, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, Jesus comes to flip the spreadsheet. It becomes an upside-down spreadsheet. That's what the Beatitudes are, because he is more concerned with the general economy and currency of love, mercy, justice at work in our churches, at work in our communities, than often we are. He comes to turn the spreadsheet and value completely different things. He flips it upside down. And he does that for my children, and he does that for you in your leadership as well, because we often as leaders can creep into using this spreadsheet mentality as well, where we value our own worth based on strength, based on ability, based on consistency, as opposed to perhaps the things that he is valuing when he comes to exalt the weak. And I've seen this time and time again with my kids, actually, of just the way in which God draws out mercy, justice, and love in other people through them and their involvement in church life. And just a recent example, actually, which was just really beautiful to me, was on a Sunday morning when I was with Anna. And we came in, and Anna is very loud in a church meeting. She doesn't have many words. She's not concerned about what people think about her. And Anna came into the room, and she kissed 3 people on the cheek, 3 women, all sitting in different parts of the hall. She went 1, 2, 3. Each woman, she didn't know, or perhaps she did, each woman struggling with addiction. And as she kissed each woman, they began to cry, one by one. And I just love this story of how Anna, that's again the spreadsheet getting flipped, going, I will use the weak. I will exalt the weak. And that counts for us as leaders as much as it counts for my children. I will use the weak, and I use my spreadsheet, the divine spreadsheet that gets flipped, and I don't operate via the world's spreadsheet. So when we use words like capacity, or even we use words like limitations, when we thoughtlessly adopt these categories into church vocabulary, we just need to be really aware and come in with our eyes open that we are buying into a lie. And that lie is that life happens on a factory floor, that we are able to control the extraneous conditions within which we work, that our input and output will remain consistently the same, irrespective of what's going on in the rest of our lives, irrespective of global pandemics, parenting challenges, medical conditions, aging parents, and relationship breakdown. You see, we know that Jesus is continually and deliberately communicating in agriculturally based parables. If we have the next slide up. And as Jesus is speaking, he's speaking based on the assumption in his audience that we've lost this assumption in ours, that there are different seasons to life and that the landscape of our lives, as well as the physical land, will look different depending on the season, and that productivity, as we understand it, will not be uniform all year round like it is on a factory floor. There will be a time for sowing, there will be a time for reaping, and the harvest, when it comes, is highly contingent on conditions that are outside of our control as well, like whether it rains or not. And in all of these landscapes of life, the abundant life of Christ is fully active as well. As we drove into Woking this morning, we passed some woodland, and we used to come and visit friends here quite a lot, and I've walked in that woodland, and at the moment, as we drove past, it looked bare and barren, and there's not a leaf on it. But I love this quote, which is from The Secret Garden, the next slide. This is from The Secret Garden, and I think it's such a beautiful quote because it pulls out how God is active in every season, and he's active in the most barren seasons, perhaps in the greatest way. Beneath the surface in that woodland, as I drove into Woking, there are bulbs working their way out of the ground. And there is a green gauze that is going to begin to spread over everything. In the next 2 weeks, next 2 or 3 weeks, you will see that woodland begin to transform. So it hasn't been a barren season. There's been stuff going on deep underneath the surface that is going to bring productivity, but it just looks different right now. And that, if anything, is our story, and perhaps it's your story too as well. So there's hidden fruitfulness. And if we can say, if we've looked at where we are historically in this industrial or post-industrial even state at the moment, how those leadership qualities have crept into our church life and our understanding, as opposed to some of those agricultural understandings of what season and limitation looks like. If we can just move on and look at where we find ourselves theologically. You see, it's very tempting at the moment, particularly, isn't it, to think that, if we could just return to a gardening mentality, everything would be fine. We'd have such a better understanding of our limitations. At which point, it's probably really helpful to revisit the Garden of Eden and think, actually, a gardening mentality probably isn't going to solve everything, because there we find the origin of people reaching for going beyond their limitations, resulting in catastrophic results. So when we're thinking about our own limitations, it's really helpful to go back to basics. And I love Jen Wilkin. If you've read Jen Wilkin, None Like Him, really, really helpful book. 10 ways in which we are different from God and why that's a good thing. But I'm going to put up a slide in just a moment, and I really feel this is quite significant for people in the room, potentially, because it's just such a simple point, but it is so helpful at the beginning of talking about limitations to understand what belongs to God and what belongs to me. What does he ask of me, and what does he never, ever ask of me? In no season of life does he ask these things. And in whatever sphere of life you're in however complex your ministry, no matter how great the demands of the people you're trying to lead, he will never, ever ask the following things of you. If you have up the next slide. He will never ask you to be infinite, to be without limitation. He will never ask you to be self-sufficient or immutable. He'll never ask you to be unchanging. He's never going to ask you to be everywhere, or to know everything, or to be all-powerful, or to be sovereign. So perhaps, if you can just take a moment and be really honest with the person sitting next to you, can you just ask them, if you wanted to steal one of those things from God, what's your greatest risk of stealing one of those things? Just take a minute. I'll tell the person next to you, where's your risk? Which of those things are you in danger of believing? Okay. Hands up for sovereign. Hands up for sovereign. Okay, that's good. I think that one would be my greatest risk as well. And I feel like the last few years, God's message to me has been, Rachel Wilson, you are not in control, but I am. He is sovereign. It's really helpful, isn't it, just to consider that list of things, actually God is never faintly disappointed in you because you don't add up to one of those things. In fact, he is actively telling you not to add up to one of those things and to understand in which lane you run and in which what belongs to him. We do great harm when we try and take things from him that were never our responsibility, that he was never asking us to do. A full and radical life in the Spirit never asks us to become any of those things. And the reason I wanted to start today talking about historical context and then to talk about theological context is actually because I think 80% of the challenges and the limitations that we faced in our life just come from being human. That's it. We might hide behind having kids with special needs, but 80% of the challenge that we face, and I think probably that you face, come from being a human. And we were designed as human with limitations. That was his good design for his children, that we would have limitations, that we would be fully human leaders, and that we would live as flourishing, limited humans and be a completely countercultural witness to the world in that as well. So just the first question to consider, stick the next slide up. Are there constraints I am interpreting as limitations, which are in fact part of God's good design for my flourishing as a fully human leader? When Zeke and Anna were small, and we were attempting to lead at the same pace as some of our peers and be on that factory floor while it felt like fire broke out in the background and it threatened our marriage, our mental health, our spiritual health, all those things. We had to make some what felt like quite radical decisions at the time, and in retrospect don't feel like radical decisions at all. And to re-understand what it meant to run a race well for God and to run a race well as leaders with perseverance. Because I think what we'd understood as running a race well those lanes almost ran from Sunday to Sunday, from speaking engagement to writing engagement to the next speaking engagement. That's what running well felt like. And in recent years, a friend of mine gave the metaphor, and she actually was saying it specifically for women, but I think the application is wider than that. That running a race, often what God calls us to, is more like a heptathlon. And it's still a race, and we're still running to win the prize, but it requires sudden changes of skill. Jessica Ennis, when she does a heptathlon, she's a heptathlete, isn't she? Yeah, had a sudden moment of doubt. When she's running her race, she's very much focused on winning the prize, but each different event is requiring a different aptitude and a sudden change of skill. And she's very much needing to adapt quickly to different settings. Likewise, I think we found that life has been like that. Certainly for Andrew, there has been moments when he's out speaking and he gets home and he's straight back into whether it's nappies or meltdowns or whatever it is. There's suddenly a quick change between family life and work life, and that's been a great challenge, but it's still a race, and it's just required more adaptation. But I think probably the punchline of the last few years of our lives has been that God, in his grace, has brought fruitfulness within our limitations that we couldn't have expected, and that our walk with God and hopefully our leadership has certainly been less smug than it otherwise would have been. And it's hopefully shaped a church culture as well where it's okay to walk with a limp. And just as a brief aside, I felt God really speak to me as a teenager about a heart for the poor, about acting justly, loving mercy, walking humbly with God. And I think the last few years have looked really different from what I expected my adult life to look like. But he has still enabled me to act out that Micah vision as well. It's happened more in my kitchen and my sitting room and in my four walls of my house than I'd expected it to. But spheres change and seasons change, but actually the call of God to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly has never been taken away from me. There have been moments when I felt like I've been benched in leadership, like God has benched me for some reason, taking me out. And now look back and think, the bulb working underground as well, that you have been active at all times. But also you have enabled me to carry out that Micah vision, just in a different setting to what I was expecting. You see, limitations, when they come, actually bring unexpected opportunities as well. Catherine Wolfe, who I don't know if you've come across, she's written a book called Suffer Strong. And she had a major stroke when she was 26. And it completely changed her and her husband's life. But she contends that as she wheels her wheelchair in to any speaking engagement, the wheelchair itself is often the biggest gift that God has given her, because it gives the capacity to expose every invisible wheelchair that is in the room. And God acts through limited leaders by allowing sometimes those walk with a limp moments, those physical wheelchairs almost, in order to expose in other people the invisible wheelchairs and the limitations that all of us are facing on the inside. I love this. We are all disabled, she says. None of us have unlimited access to whatever we want or whatever we planned for our lives to look like. We are constrained by our marriages or our singleness, by our children or our childlessness, by our obligations or our debts, by obstacles real or imagined. No one enters life or leaves it without feeling bound by something. Some of us have physical wheelchairs, but we all have invisible wheelchairs inside of us. None of us can do life all by ourselves. We need God and we need each other. Really helpful. I love when my kids get set targets at school, it's constantly talking about independence, working towards independence. Where are we on these independence skills? And I'd love it if they just changed it to interdependence, because independence is a lousy goal for all of us, especially as leaders. Interdependence is a far greater goal. She goes on, we'll just wait for a sec for the next slide if that's right. She goes on to talk about how these limitations are modelled in how Jesus actively chooses to come and to incarnate himself. And I've got a little bit of a hobby horse about this at the moment, because the way in which, the time in which, and the way in which Jesus comes and actively chooses to be incarnated is just fascinating and exposes his heart towards the vulnerable in a really beautiful way, because he did not need to come and have an experience of life as a refugee. But he comes, he makes himself a baby, he makes himself an incontinent baby who grows into a toddler, who then experiences life as a toddler, as a refugee, when every other boy in his hometown of Bethlehem is being massacred. Every time he goes back to Bethlehem, he knows what persecution is like, because there's no other boy his exact same age. And he has experienced what it is to know persecution, to know what it's like to be driven from your homeland. He incarnates himself even with additional limitations. He adds limitations to himself by coming in the way he does in the incarnation in order to identify with the incontinent, to identify with the refugee, to identify with the persecuted. He willingly, sacrificially adopts on those human limitations so that he truly can say he's walked in our shoes and he knows what it is to be fully human. So if we have the next slide, this is still Catherine Wolfe, and yet when we think about the life of Jesus, we overlook the fact that considering he was Almighty God, the physical world he came into was not made for him either. He chose to constrain his godness to a very limited human body. He disabled himself, so to speak. Since Jesus willingly took on the constraints of humanity, then our constraints can likewise be dignified. Wow. He chose to enter the mess and loss and living in our world. He chose to get low in order to ultimately be made high so that somehow we can too. He comes to dignify limitations. And there will be people in your churches who can read 2 Corinthians 4:7 about being jars of clay to show that the all-surpassing treasure is from God and not from us. But they need to see it modelled as well. They need to see it modelled well in leadership. Vulnerability modelled well. We need to see it, we see it in the human life of Christ, but we also need to see it in the lives of limited leaders. And this is something actually Andrew and I have felt many times, we've experienced time and time again, particularly as we care for Anna. And one of the unexpected things that's come out of the life you never expected has been in way in which suffering is transferable. And I think I was really naive about that. I thought suffering was ring-fenced. So I thought, you can only minister to somebody else's suffering if it really mirrors yours. That's not the way in which God works, because the jar isn't the point of the verse. The treasure is the point of the verse, isn't it? The treasure is from God, and it's about his glory as opposed to our specifically shaped jar of limitations. We've had this several times with our church leader up north, who they had to do a tube feed change at the end of every Sunday morning on their daughter. And it was a 2-to-1 ratio to do the tube feed change, which meant it was really difficult for him to talk to guests. His church family was so wise, and they said to him, that speaks loudly. God's speaking to other people in the room. Even as you change your daughter's tube feed, it might speak louder than the sermon you just preached, actually. So when we live within our limitations, when we live within our design of God, it might be the equivalent for you. I don't know what your wheelchair is that you wheel into the room, where you say, I too, Jesus identifies with the weak. I can identify with the weak too. So the next question I just wanted you to consider was, what would it look like to model vulnerability and weakness well in your context? And the first thing, just to share with this one, is to choose vulnerability over victimhood. And this is a really key generational one as well. I think this is quite a timely challenge, because actually there is a real emphasis on authenticity at the moment and vulnerability, isn't there? But we have power to either make people feel bad about their situations, or we have power to glorify God and locate our story within a much bigger story about how good he is. Because our story of vulnerability or our story of weakness might get sympathy, and sympathy's nice. But when we locate our story within the bigger story of the gospel, he gets glory, and that's far better. Between sympathy and glory, we want glory to win out every time. You see, in fact, I think 2 Corinthians 4 is really helpful on this. It says, we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned, never abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Paul, in that verse, is so honest about the real cost of suffering. But he's also very aware of the weighty promise of eternity that is in the other hand as well. And he makes the story of his suffering part of the broader story of the hope and witness of resurrection life. So how can we locate our individual stories within far greater stories of the gospel? And we do that by choosing vulnerability over victimhood. And we also do it by establishing circles of trust. And this is really helpful, I think. Just if you can, I haven't done it as a slide, but a bullseye image almost, where you think there are certain things that I'm going to share with my spouse. There are certain things I'm going to share with my life group, perhaps, with a broader group of friends, a broader group of leaders. There are certain things I'm going to share from a stage, and there are certain things I might write in a book. Those concentric circles are just a helpful way of just thinking who and in what setting is it wisest for me to be vulnerable. And this is a real generational challenge as well, actually, because in fact, it can be much easier in my experience to share vulnerability into a microphone from a stage than it is to share vulnerability within an accountable friendship. And it can be quite a lazy way of being vulnerable as well. I know that's been my experience. In fact, my parents said they said, a sibling of yours, we know by 8 a.m. the next morning if she's going through a hard time. With you, we know when the book comes out. And probably the worst thing about that was I felt really good. I just thought, yes, that's what I'm going for, because it just made me feel stoic and you can't read me and all these things. But it does come to mind that perhaps my sibling has a more healthy emotional life and has used those concentric circles of trust in a wiser way than at times I have. Into a microphone is sometimes easier than into a functioning, accountable, true, deep friendship with people. So just think, what does it look like to model vulnerability well as a leader in your context? Okay, the next question just to consider, and this is, I've deliberately worded it this way, what would it look like to cooperate with your suffering? This is a tough one, and I'm trusting you really to discern there is a time for battle, and there is also a time to engage with the character formation that God promises in his word that he will bring through your pain. So when God allows or even ordains that extra 20%, those additional limitations in our lives, things that go above and beyond what we expect as default human life, how can we actively engage and work with him in whatever mysterious thing he's doing, and all the while praying that, please God, this challenge would pass quickly? Because his desire, when he comes, when he prunes us or disciplines us or allows us to go through trials, it's never pointless. And that's been one of the hardest lessons, I think, to learn. There have been times when Zeke used to run laps in the kitchen and Anna did circles around the kitchen table. So they were literally, every now and again, there'd be a collision. And it felt like in those moments, it was almost the hardest to go, God, how is this not completely pointless? What is being gained? Been up since 4. What's being gained by this? This is pointless. Your head starts to go in circles as well. And it's been some of the more mundane things of life sometimes that have almost gone closest to breaking me, more than the big dramatic things. Things like seizures, I can almost see this is suffering. God is working through it. Things like tiredness, I find that harder because I just think, Lord, where's the point? But there is a point which is promised. We had that slide back up. Because we are looking to work with him with the grain of the wood to say, God, you promise me that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and that hope will not put me to shame because God's love has been poured into my heart through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. There are promises attached to our suffering as well. So how can we cooperate, work with the grain of the wood? Whether it's, for me, that grain of the wood, working with that has almost been that message of, I'm not in control, but God is in control. And it feels like a lesson I've had to learn again and again and again. But there's a way to work with him and partner with him. And we know that famous verse, Romans 8:28, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. But he doesn't work apart from us. So he chooses to partner with us in working all things for good. Because another translation of that verse is, for we know that in all things, God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good. So he gives us agency. He gives us an ability to partner with him, even in our trials and tribulations, for character and for hope to ultimately come. God retains sovereignty, but he actively offers agency. We can just have the next slide up quickly. We have an active role to play in partnering with him for good to come out of our trials. This is just from Sharon Hodder Miller's book, The Cost of Control. I just found it really helpful, the difference between control and agency. So God is retaining all of those things that we had on that previous slide, right? He's retaining his own sovereignty, he's retaining his own immutability, but he's also giving us agency. And there is great freedom and there should be, as you look at that table, a sense of a sigh of relief. Of going, when I am acting within my own agency and not trying to take control from him, suddenly the task he's given me to do seems really compelling and really doable. Just helpful. I'm hoping that table in some ways just evokes Psalm 131 for you. So it says, my heart is not lifted too high, my eyes are not raised up, but I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. He's given me something to partner with him in doing that is compelling and doable. Okay, next question. Are you with me? Yeah? Okay. Next question. Who is God placing around you? And who is he placing you around? I love Acts 27 to 28, where Paul, he's desperate to get to Rome, but he just keeps being interrupted. And he's trying to cross the Mediterranean. He's radically thrown off course. And he ends up being washed up on a beach in Malta. And by some miracle, all of the crew, 276 people on board, they reach the beach in Malta. And there's a beautiful verse just hidden in Acts 28 where it says, the islanders showed us unusual kindness. God has prepared some people who don't know anything about him yet, and they're going to soon. But they're going to show Paul and these crewmates unusual kindness. So if your plans face shipwreck right now, who has God placed around you showing you unusual kindness? And for us, when you go through a season of challenge, perhaps you're the same, different role models suddenly become really impressive, don't they? When you face a particular type of suffering, you think, gosh, I hadn't maybe fully appreciated that person before, but now I want to learn everything about how they've got through this. There have been times like that. It's been like a chessboard where God has put people around us to protect us and to help us move forward. Andrew mentioned them before, but Steve and Anne Blaber were those people for us in Eastbourne. And I still remember being at a barbecue with Anne the first time I met her, and she looked at Zeke's feet, which was where it all began about his walking and things. She said, he's got Piedro boots on. And I just thought, yes, he does. And I thought, God's brought me someone, and she showed me how to be a carer, and she modelled it so well, and she walked through grief with me. And she became a source of God's grace to me because I knew that he had placed her there for that time, and I knew it was him saying, I'm with you. And there's people like that who are going to be in your life already where you almost just need to open your eyes and go, there's someone who's gone before me who's done this, and I can follow them. I can follow them forward. They can protect me. We can walk together for a little while. And there are people, I felt really challenged when they moved on. I remember thinking, just feeling really sad. That Sunday morning we said goodbye to them. And I felt God speak to me as well, going, you need to be that person for someone else now. And it felt like a really intimidating challenge, but God can open your eyes to who those people are for you, but also to who he's calling you to as well. Okay, there's unusual kindness in store for you. Okay, next question. I'm going to say, what does it look like to say yes? So we talk a lot about saying no in these contexts when we're talking about limitations, but what does it look like if we want to say yes to something, to a challenge, to a mission that God's given us? What does it look like to say yes? And a leader friend of mine actually was really helpful on this. He said, when you've got a prize racehorse, you probably don't feel good. I didn't feel good he was being called a prize racehorse in this context. He felt a little bit self-conscious and English about it. You don't put a prize racehorse in every race because they will get tired. You need to be selective about which races they're running, because if you want that prize racehorse to have as much of a lifespan as it can, it needs to be selective and just choose the races that only they can run. They've got specific gifting to do. That's just a helpful illustration. And he'd given me this word, and I was thinking about it. I was thinking, yes, that's a great word. And I was walking around New Day, the site, and I was with Anna, and she could only be on site for about half an hour a day, and I was managing her the whole time. And I was walking past seminars and things and thinking, God, this is hard, though, because it feels like these races, I feel like I could contribute here. This feels like one to say yes to. And I took her for a walk. In the end, we gave up. We left the site, and we went for a walk near some wooded area. Is it right to stick the slide back up? We went for a walk around some wooded area, and I spotted this horse, and I thought, that's weird, I'm just thinking about this horse. And it's this exact one. And God spoke to me so clearly, because as I was looking at the horse, I realised there was a foal standing behind it. And the foal was hidden. But God said to me, Rachel, there will be races, and there will be foals. And you need to learn your races, and you need to learn your foals. There will be people, and it doesn't need to be children. There will be people who take a disproportionate amount of your energy, your love, your care. And actually, God's calling you to those foals, and he's calling you to the races. And knowing the difference between the two is really helpful and really releasing as well. Yeah, so be selected. The next one is to be seasonal. What does it say? Look to say yes for a season. At the moment, I've just taken on a role at Jubilee Plus. And I'm loving it. It's brilliant. I'm so enjoying just helping equip churches better for social action and for reaching the poor. And I'm also, in the back of my mind, know that I've got my eldest hitting 16, and he will move from children's services to adult services in just a couple of years' time. And it's really intimidating, because suddenly I will need to then become an engine of momentum again and to re-involve. So there are yeses that I can say sometimes that are seasonal yeses. I know I can do this because I can see that challenge coming afar off, and God's given me the grace to do this now. And that might need to change, but for now, he's given me the grace to do this, so I can say yes. Finally, contingent. So every preaching or teaching invitation that Andrew replied to for a long time, I think it might have even been this one, had an email that had a line at the bottom of the email that said something to the effect of, I am saying yes, but it is possible that I will need to let you down at the very last minute due to complications at home. You need to have a plan B. So we hardly ever had to use that line at the bottom of the email, but the fact that it was there just felt like a weight off my shoulders. Okay, we've communicated that at the outset. So we've talked today about where we find ourselves historically, theologically, and practically. But I wonder if you could stand, because I just want to finish off. Andrew's going to come up as well and grab a mic, because I just want to finish off by talking about where we find ourselves supernaturally. Because it would be easy to focus on our limitations and to neglect the fact that we have a limitless God and what he promises to bring to the table. We bring our meagre offering, and he comes to multiply. See, I think there might be people here even who feel like they're in a season of life where they've been benched, and the margin of what they see, what you perhaps feel you have to offer, feels painfully small in this season of life. But there's a limitless God whose MO, his modus operandi, is to work through the weak. He actively shows preference for the weak. He actively picks out the weak. Why? Because it shows his all-sufficiency, and he's delighted and determined to show his all-sufficiency. So perhaps just close your eyes. Because I just feel like if you come, even as you can visualise, you've got your loaves and your fishes. You come with your human offering, and God says, I will come and multiply it. I delight to take your meagre offering, and I delight to multiply it. In Ecclesiastes it says, cast your bread upon the water. And my prayer really for today is that there will be people here who've counted themselves out when they've actually got something that, yes, is really costly, but is also really precious and really beautiful to bring. And I just love that passage when Jesus says that wherever the gospel is preached, the woman who brings her costly offering, she will be told of. Thank you, Lord God. We come to you. We say we're up for cost. And we bring what we have. And we thank you for your smile upon us. And we thank you for your delight in us. And we thank you for your promise to, by your grace, come and multiply it. and to meet and comfort and lead many, many people. Many people in our churches with invisible wheelchairs inside of them. Lord Jesus, I pray, would you use us as the weak leaders often to demonstrate your strength in their situation as well as in ours. Thank you, Lord.